Hello, photo class. This slideshow is basically to set you up for the next assignment on shallow depth of field and slow shutter speed blur. So basically, just using your camera to generate areas that are in focus and out of focus, so you can lead the eye, through the composition and emphasize the focal point. Um, the photo I have up right now is a photo I took in Central Park a few years ago. And originally, the photo is pretty much all in focus. I used Photoshop to do selective blur. So that's a separate video I'm going to do and send you on how to use Photoshop to basically create points of emphasis in your photo. So here, the splash of water coming off is the focal point along with the angel. So that helps guide your eye to that because everything else is blurred out. It's an effect I really like in photography. All right, so your assignment, you're going to create 3 photos using Aperture to control sharpness, selective sharpness, in other words, leaving certain areas blurry. You're going to do 3 photos using shutter speed to control that, and then you're going to edit at least 1 photo in Photoshop to achieve selective sharpness. Now, if you're using your phone as your camera for this class, you may have a hard time controlling aperture and shutter speed to get that kind of selective blur and sharpness. So if that's the case for you, now you did all download an app to help you control that, but even so, if you're still having trouble getting it, you can do more in Photoshop with this. Instead of just doing the 1 photo in Photoshop, you could do more if that's helpful to you. These photos are due for a critique that we'll do on April 23rd for those that are able to make it. And that also means you have to upload it to your Padlet by Wednesday at noon. I'll put that in my email too, reminder of the deadlines, but that way I can put it in a slideshow for class. All right, so your camera basically is controlling the amount of light needed for a good exposure. So in order to make a good photo, you need a good exposure, and that just means how light or dark the photo is. And that's generally up to you, what your creative aims are in the photo, how light or dark, or how mid-level the darks are. You control that through shutter and aperture and the ISO settings on the camera. And so shutter just refers to how long the shutter is open. You can use your camera manual or in shutter priority mode to control that best. Aperture setting refers to the size of the opening in the lens that lets light in. And again, you can control that in manual, or you can use aperture priority setting to choose aperture easily. And then ISO is a sensitivity to light of the camera sensor, and you go into your settings for that. I showed you on a previous lesson on how to do that. By setting that automatically can be useful, but it can also be good to go in and set that individually too. It just depends on what your goals are when you're taking photos. I generally set my ISO to automatic, and I limit it so that it won't go over about 1600 ISO. And so I just sort of set it and don't really think about it too much. If I'm shooting something for serious purposes where I know the photos have to be really good, I'll set the ISO to 100 and make sure that it's like really smooth grain on the photo. All right, so that leads us to this concept called the exposure triangle. You'll hear about that often when you hear about exposure. And so this is a really good graphic. I've got the URL for the website if you want to go and download one for yourself. I recommend printing something like this out and keeping it with you because it really helps you understand photography. But this just shows how the shutter speeds work, what the basic shutter speed numbers are, and at what settings it freezes motion. So if you're trying to stop something really fast, you could use, as you can see on the diagram there, using around 1,000th or 2,000th of a second, it's really going to stop action really well. And if you're looking for something blurry, or you're trying to avoid blur, you would want to avoid those lower shutter speed settings. For this assignment, you're actually going to use shutter speed to create blur. So you'd want to use like 1/8 of a second or 1/2 a second shutter speed to generate that sense of blur. Aperture settings on the right, that shows you the numbers that you're going to encounter when you use your aperture, and it shows you where you have less depth of field and more depth of field. From 1.4 if you've got a really big lens, down to f22 on the smaller end. And then the ISO settings, it shows you the numbers there at the bottom. So this is a really handy guide to show how all 3 of those things work in sync to give you exposure. And I'll elaborate and explain that as we move on. This next slide, this is another good diagram. I've got the where you can find the website. You can find this diagram if you want to download a copy for yourself too. It's another one I recommend printing out while you're learning photo settings. That top shows the aperture settings and how those impact what's in focus and out of focus, showing that the lower numbers, 2, 2.8, and 4, those typically give you shallow depth of field, and as the numbers get higher, and the opening in the aperture gets smaller, you get much more depth of field, meaning more things are in focus. And then you can see the shutter speeds outline and what those shutter speed numbers are, from sharp on the fast shutter speeds to blurry on slow shutter speeds. And then the ISO is really handy, sort of shows you how as you go up in ISO up to 800 and 6400 ISO, you get a lot more noise in your image, that sort of grainy, sort of ugly colors that show up from that. Aperture is actually, if you have a detachable lens, you can pop it off or just look in there, and when you take a picture, you can actually see the aperture close down on the smaller aperture settings. Usually, if it were in class, I would pass around a couple of old manual focus lenses from old cameras and sort of show you how aperture works. But because we're doing this online, a little bit harder to demonstrate this example. But you can pause the slide and read that if you like. Yeah, this is a slide from a photo textbook I have. The info is down there at the bottom. This really is a handy slide for understanding how exposure works. This concept that there's multiple things that you're setting and that there's multiple variables you can put together to basically achieve the same exposure. You'll notice all three of these photos have the same exposure in that they're the same levels of gray, say in the concrete sidewalk or stone sidewalk there. So there's the same levels of blacks and grays. So that means the exposure is the same. The amount of light getting into to the sensor, in this case film, is the same. But what's changing are those other variables. And so you can see on the far left image that the shutter speed's 1/8 of a second, which is really slow. And that the aperture above it is f16, which is a really high number, which means you have a really small opening, which generates a really good depth of field. So if you look at the photo itself, you see the pigeons are blurry and out of focus because they're in motion, and 1/8 of a second wasn't fast enough to stop that. And then at a 16 aperture setting, the stones in the foreground on the sidewalk are in focus, and the trees all the way in the background are in focus. If you flip it around to the image on the far right, it's a 5/100th of a second shutter speed, which is really fast, and then f2 on the aperture setting. And so, as you can see, because of the aperture setting, this has shallow depth of field. The pigeons are in focus, but the trees in the background are out of focus. But because of the shutter speed, it's a really sharp image and everything's in focus. And then the middle is a kind of middle of the road exposure where the pigeons are somewhat in focus and the foreground and background depth of field is all somewhat in focus. The trees get a little bit blurry. So you just have to choose based on what you want. If you wanted an ethereal sort of image of these ghostly birds, you would choose a slow shutter speed, as in on the left. But if you want sharpness and to freeze the birds in flight, you choose a really fast shutter speed. Another component of this exposure triangle graphic is this idea in the middle that I've circled in orange, the 0 up to 1 plus 2 minus 1 minus 2. That's just this idea of exposure compensation. So zeroed out is what your camera's light meter thinks is a good exposure. And so that's automatically what it's going to want to go to. And so it's up to you if you're working in manual mode on your camera to either go above or below that zeroed out setting on the light meter, or if you're in aperture or shutter priority mode, it automatically chooses to go to 0, and then you can use what's called exposure compensation, which usually cameras have a little button that has a plus over minus, as you see in the lower left image, that you push, and then you'll turn a dial either on the front, on the back of the camera, or in front of the camera. There'll be a dial that you turn, so you just need to figure that out on your particular camera, how to use exposure compensation. And then a little graphic will pop up where you see a plus 1 or minus 1 and so forth. And so just be sure you know how to use exposure compensation. It's a really useful tool. These are photos I took in the Spanish Cathedral at Santa Maria Novella in Florence, Italy a few years ago. And this image, the image in the middle, it's a really dark space, and I love that sort of wrought iron covering over the window. So in the middle is just a zeroed out exposure that the camera chose. And on the left is the same thing, but I took the picture again and took 2 stops of exposure away. So basically underexposed it to sort of show what it was really like in there, because it was a dark room, really brightly lit through the window. And then on the right, it has plus 2 stops of light added in exposure compensation. And so that actually gets into where you can see the frescoes on the wall. And so if that was important to you, that would be the setting you would choose. And so this are those same things translated into black and white. And as a black and white image, I think the image on the left, the darker one, is much more powerful because it emphasizes the beauty of the shadows on the floor, and the light coming through that wrought iron on the window. Whereas the image on the right, if I were more interested in the frescoes, that would be the better image. But to me, it seems a little less artistic because you can see the little chair that the guard sits in, and the lights don't look, the little light stand. It just doesn't look as artistic as of an image to me. This is taken in the same little chapel, and this is the light meter setting that my camera chose. It basically shoots for a sort of mid-gray tone. It kind of assumes that everything you're going to photograph has a sort of similar level of lighting. And so it actually chose this, and it didn't let me get the image in focus because my shutter speed had to be too slow to let that much light in. And so it's probably about 1/4 of a second shutter speed to get that setting. And so on the next image, when I took the photo again to get a better shot, because I saw this image on the back of my camera and realized it was overexposed, too bright, and also out of focus, I shot it again using exposure compensation. I pushed the button, clicked it over a couple of notches till it was a -2 on the exposure compensation. And now the fresco on the wall is in focus. The exposure is much better. It looks much more natural to what we were seeing. And so for the assignment, you're using selective focus. So you're choosing when to blur things, when to have things in and out of focus. And these were just right outside my house here in Monmouth. And there's ice covered, the leftovers of flowers, out in the yard. And so 2 images. One, I'm using about a f/22 aperture setting. And on this one, I'm using a 2.8 aperture setting. And so with 2.8 aperture setting, that's a wider open aperture. Basically, that isolates the ice-covered flowers much better because you don't see the texture in the snow and everything. And also, that graphic element of the diagonal shadow in the background works more smoothly as a graphic element to me. So in this case, I think a shallow depth of field is good for the image because it really makes those things stand out. This is an image I took behind my parents' house in Alabama, and I would say this is a bad example of shallow depth of field because right in your face is a blurry thing in the foreground. Those hydrangea flowers in the fall are just sort of totally out of focus there. So probably best if I moved so they weren't in the way, and then those hydrangeas that are in focus were more, the focal point, or just switch it. So here the focal point is just on the blurry thing that's right in my face there. And I think that works a lot better. Or maybe even get closer, and here you see a lot more texture in the individual flower leaves of the hydrangea. And then the same photo session, walking around behind my parents' house. They actually have this huge waterfall behind their house. There's the waterfall. So back to this photo. So this is shot just kind of at a normal shutter speed, around a 1/60th of a second. And it's an okay photo. But if you want that kind of really dramatically beautiful effect where the water is all kind of blurry and has a sense of motion to it, very atmospheric, you'll need a slower shutter speed. So I wasn't using a tripod here. I think I just went with about 1/4 of a second shutter speed and just leaned up against a tree to kind of stabilize myself. A better option would be to use a tripod, but it's just walking around with a camera in the woods, so I wasn't really prepared. But you can do things like that to steady your camera, and that's going to be an important thing to do when it comes to shutter speed blur, is using a tripod or setting your camera on something stable. If you have a timer on your camera where you can choose to push the button and then 5 seconds later it fires off, do that so your camera's not wiggling while you take the photo.